Hello, Jim. Thank you so much for joining me again on another episode of the Emil podcast. And this is the third time I've had you on. One is already uploaded, and there are a couple, including this one now, that will be uploading very soon. But it's really I think I should have you as a resident on this show, so we can just explore ideas and
Yeah.
just kind of.
Oh, then you gotta, if each is a single event, you don't have to pay me ever. Once it becomes habit forming, then somebody gets charged.
I think that's a good point to consider because yeah, I love our conversations, and what I think is really important is that they remain fun, they remain nuanced, and that we're able to approach them at a really in-depth level. I think this is why I enjoy our conversations and the conversations that I have on our show, is because we don't just have little sound bites, and we don't have just little things that you kind of capture in a clip. It's more a let's explore this theme and let's kind of just run on into it and see where it takes us. Which brings us to today. You're a neuroscientist. You have been working. Oh God! Actually, remind our audience, how long have you been in the field?
Hundreds of thousands of years, Emil. Yeah, the first research I was ever involved in was 1968, and so I started as a biologist, and then I got a degree right after that. After it was chemistry and physics and biology, and then went into psychology. So I got a degree in psychology, and then went into WET, kind of hardcore neuroscience, neurophysiology, neuroanatomy, neuropharmacology, and behavior too. Experimental as opposed to human, the human end of it. And after a lot of years of doing basic neuroscience research, then starting in 1989, I was asked by my colleagues, a lot of them were medical students that I had had before then, where they wanted me to do analyses of PET scans, and then later, fMRIs and SPECT scans, et cetera, and EEGs, but to look at the biological data having to do with schizophrenia and addictions. I started working addictions in the 80s with some of the genetics of it and imaging. And then from about 89, scattered about studying the brains of regular killers and serial killers and psychopaths. And that has been going on for about 30 years, where I've been looking at those. But I've spent, and that's a minor thing, but nonetheless, people tend to be interested in that. And so and I've worked a lot in the past 15, 20 years with the Pentagon, Department of Defense, and also at the Vatican, and working with a lot of companies. I'm the chief scientific officer of a gene editing company now for changing behavior through CRISPR and other technologies. And also I'm involved still, with a lot of clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease and schizophrenia and others. And I'm brought in as a neuroanatomist. I like, the patterns of those, and also in combination with the genetics and behavior, since I've had training, very general training in all of these since the late 1960s, early 70s. So all of these, I use all of these, and so I'm involved in that. But I work with screenwriters, with producers every day. I mean, they come down from Hollywood, New York, to my house usually twice a week, because they're creating screenplays, and they want real psychiatric and psychological characters, and they want real, what is the next technology that can be used for forensics and for the shows, a lot of crime shows, et cetera, but also futuristic shows. So I do a lot of work every week with different showrunners, screenwriters, developing stories of all sorts. And I do that, it's fun, right? But it's also my way, since I'm, mostly I don't really work at the university anymore. I live at the university, but I'm not, I don't do all the regular professor things anymore.
Mm.
And so, but at any rate, so it's basically I do anything I want, which is I've always kind of done that, which is an annoyance to my colleagues and to the deans, and they want you to be very focused. And I've just never done that because I've got spielkes. I'm not Jewish, but I know that means ants in the pants in Yiddish. And so I just think that, and I'm glad I was like that I never committed to any one thing. It's maddening because you're supposed to just focus and be the expert in this thing your whole life.
Mm.
The way you bring in most money as a professor, and that's what it's about. If you're at a large university, I'm at the University of California, Irvine, and
Yeah.
they all want you to be an expert and a moneymaker and the guy to go to or the gal to go to for a very specific thing, which to me is absolute nightmare. And so I've been able to avoid that. So I do kind of anything I want. I always have, because everything's interesting, Emil. Really.
Yeah, 100%. And I can see it from your uh, your plane of possibilities. They're kind of just there and there and there and there. And your interests when it comes to even our conversations in the past have been really exploring many different themes, where when we consider the different themes that we've touched on political discussions, we've touched on things like the neuroscience, we've touched on psychopathy, sociopathy, we've looked at history, even going back to World War One and the communist era and that sort of stuff. So I think when you consider your own history and moving back into your studies, I mean, to put it into context, 1968 was 3 years after my father was born. So you've been doing this for a very long time, and I think you've got such a wealth of knowledge behind you that I can just pick at like I'm trying to think of it, like it's almost like a scalpel knowledge in your field, but then you're able to kind of just survey many other areas as well, which is where our conversation brings us today. I wanted to explore lockdowns. And the reason I wanted to explore lockdowns is not because I'm an expert in lockdowns or you have an expertise in lockdowns, but more because they're here, they're now. And I want to put my hand from a mental health point of view, from a neuroscientific point of view, and even from a historical point of view. How can we come to understand what's actually happening here? We don't have a significant precedent on what we've experienced here. For context, Australia right now, as I'm recording this, it is the 14th of September in Australian time, and we've been in our 6th statewide lockdown here in Victoria, which has lasted for over 200 days. So for context, that the only 2 other nations from what I've looked at were Chile and Peru that had longer lockdowns. I think theirs went for about 6 months or so. We're bordering on over 5 months now. And it might be more than that. I'm not sure. How much is over 200 days? We've got like almost 2/3 of a year. So here we've got this kind of discussion. And I want to remind our audience that we're fresh, it's more of an exploratory or an observational discussion that we'll have today. And if there is research that we'll point to, I'll make sure to link to that. But if anyone wants any further context from a mental health point of view, I'd encourage them to shoot over to my previous episode, which was focusing on lockdowns from a mental health point of view and surveying the literature, the peer-reviewed literature, as well as certain stories that were emerging from Australia in terms of the impacts of the lockdowns. So I hope I've caught you at a good time, Jim, and we can kind of just jump on into it and I can pose you questions. How are you feeling about that?
Great. Okay. We haven't talked about this, so it's just pretty wide open. Let's have at it.
Well, before I do jump into it, I want to ask you, you've read many books over your time. You've done many studies, or I assume you've read many books. You've got a bookshelf right behind you. If you consider your bookshelf behind you, what's your favorite book that lives in that shelf?
Well, since my wife, who was a writer, an avid reader, and she doesn't do it as much anymore, and I still do. And she said we have to get rid of a lot of books. So I emptied out 180 books from this bookshelf, and this is still
Wow.
because they're all backed up. So to give them away. So I gave away 180 there, and about 300 from the living room where the bookshelf is. And so the when you're our age, our generation, it's like, well, what do you want to leave the kids and grandkids? And since people don't read too much anymore, it's like, well, they're not going to want books. And so, just let's bring them to places where people like to read books. Maybe, and not a big charity, but as charity, and bring it to places that don't have books. I did this when I first went to Africa. I got all these books that I brought to Africa. They didn't have textbooks. So I got so many free books donated that I brought over, tons of books to East Africa, mostly medical because they didn't quite have them. And so I'm not completely wrapped up in books. I don't particularly like to read. I'm not a pleasure reader at all. And for me, the books are for information. And
Okay.
so I'm not one of these people. I have a lot of friends who just will read constantly. I'm not that type of person. I read because I want to know what information is there. It's not a pleasure thing. If I want pleasure, I read the racing form, in my jacuzzi, or I do crossword puzzles, or when somebody says to me after the second or third, they said, read this book, and after that, I will do that, but I won't do it spontaneously. So I'm really not a reader, although I read I read constantly. I've always read constantly, but I'm not a reader. You see what I mean? It's you can be
Okay.
you can be, I guess, an athlete, but hate exercising. You like to be in a sport, you like to be in the event, but you don't
Yep.
like, when you're not doing that, you don't go out every day just to run because it's so much fun. And so I don't particularly like to read, but I read constantly. And as the good thing about at this point, after, being able to add to the science, because everything was just, if you're a scientist, you have to read constantly about in your area. So you don't get to get out of that. And since in the past 15 years, I've been able to read much further out from that, like I did when I was younger. College, mostly when I was younger, when reading philosophy, and now I spent a lot of time reading philosophy. So a lot of those books back there are classic, from the pre-Socratic to the Socratic and beyond era, and a lot of the troublemakers, which are almost all German, 18th, 19th century writers, from Hegel on forward. These are the ones that gave us every major problem in the world. And so I read a lot of that. I read a lot of Heidegger and Hegel, but beyond that, I mean, also, Avicenna and all sorts of them. But in order to understand those, you got to read all the stuff going back. Yeah,
that's right, and I think they build onto each other. A lot of the ideas are just rehashed, and you get a lot of repetition, and it's hard to find across new ideas. I think it was I can't remember which philosopher it was, but he mentioned that he didn't have much to add to philosophy. So what he wanted to do was to try to not to talk about how life is, how to make life better, but how life is so bad. And goodness me, I've opened a topic that I'm not too well versed in, and I can't even remember the philosopher's name right now, but it will come back to me as we continue our conversation. And he was one of the existential philosophers that I'm referring to right now. And what I would say is, if we take a view in terms of lockdowns. Actually, let's jump into the lockdown questioning, because when we consider lockdowns, as we've said before, this is something that we haven't experienced, we haven't seen to this extent. We haven't seen a viral threat that is perusing the world to the extent that we have right now, in terms of impacting every single crevice of behavior and society, and the very fabric of society, which have from the beginning, I think it was March in 2020, nations began to lock down their citizens. And you heard horrific stories coming out of places like China, where doors were welded shut, and even in certain Asian countries, there were threats that people will be shot if they were found outside of curfew. And then you have curfews being instituted, and people not being able to leave their premises probably once a week. Some were able to leave, according to various news forums here in Victoria, and I'm not sure whether it's similar in California. But right now, our main reasons to leave home are things like going shopping, having a bit of exercise, or you've got a curfew on that's from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. We are unable to go to most of the shops that are for leisure. Everything's takeaway. There's no eating sort of things. If you're out without a mask and you don't have a valid exemption, then you can be fined. If you're out of your 5-kilometer radius, which is not 5, we have a 5-kilometer radius, which means that from where you are at, 2.5 kilometers, all the way around you is where you're allowed to go. You're not allowed to go.
It couldn't be more obvious that this is a group of people politically trying to control people and to train them into being sheep. There's no question about this. And this has been true for both the far left and far right. This is what the far left and far right do. This is fascism is about the togetherness of government in large business, right? And that's what it fundamentally is. It's not Nazism. But fascism, more generally, like right now, in the United States, our government is left-wing fascist. It's filled with Marxists, and they're very intolerant, and they spend most of the time planning up these rules to lock you down and to get you to accept it. And we keep, you can see it rolling through every few months. It was, COVID, that lockdown, but now the next thing, it will be the climate. If we get a hurricane, we have to lock everybody down and keep everybody very confined because of climate change, which is everything. So this is classic tyrannical far left and far right stuff. Right now, it's the far left that's doing it. It's the far right isn't doing this at all now. It hasn't, in the past. A lot of people forget this because a lot of young people don't have any memory of this whatsoever. And so, and for them, it's okay because, and I say it for them, I'm talking about a certain subgroup because it's very personality, individual dependent. There are people who want to control other people. And then there are people who are willing to be controlled, very passive. And then there's people that don't want to be messed with at all, but have no drive to control anybody. These are the libertarians, right? Now the libertarian, is derived from Bakunin, who was a kind of father of the anarchist movement, and he brought Spain, in the 19th century, and that's what gave rise to this idea of what he would call the Antifa, not just the Antifa, but the anarchistic movement. But the thing is, the anarchistic movement is not like we would consider like a real libertarian view. Anarchists are communists, right? Except they don't want a big government. They don't want a federal government. They want, local control, but it's still all about control. And that's so this was, had roots in the mid-19th century, including from the Paris Commune and, Marx's son-in-law onward. And that kind of proliferated through, especially not only from, Germany and Russia in the 19 teens and 20s, and in Germany, but also then from Spain, and then after the communists lost in Spain, they brought it to Cuba and different parts of South America, and then from South America, it went other places, and so they always have had this different styles, right? And the styles would be the kind of the fascist, communist, anarchist, and then there's the fascist ones, but they're never really libertarian. They're always involved a government or group that wants to control other people's behavior. And a lot of times these people are sociopathic in the sense that they want to get even. These are people who feel like losers, and now it's their turn to lord it over people. And so it attracts people who feel like they've been lorded over, either because of their identity, or it was their class, now it's identity. And so those people who want to get even, these are great vehicles, right? The far left and far right are classically been great vehicles to turn it into a political ideology, but it's really about getting even and turning the world upside down. Now, anybody in my age who had lived through the problems in Eastern Europe, with the Soviets and those various things, where they're back and forth between Nazis and then the communists and then most of the communists, they can see it coming. So anybody my age and a bit older can see what's going on now. They've said, well, yeah, this is what happened when the Soviets came in and when the Red Brigade came in, and they see it. But if you're really young, it's like, well, no, we should be controlling people. These people they can make us sick, or they can use too much gas. You see, they should be controlled. And so I think there's a lot of this in a very personal, individualized way. The people who want to control other people and people who don't want to control other people. And so there's this personalized sort of, personal politics that become more than group politics and groupthink behaviors, which is what we're seeing now. So the ability to make you can only go within 2 miles, it makes no sense, right? There's no medical sense, but it's like, see, I can control you, and I'm going to get you used to this. I'm going to keep throwing things, climate crisis, the virus crisis, poverty crisis, homeless, all of these, we keep rotating them to keep you in constant fear.
I want to pick up on,
Yeah.
I guess, because I think you've raised quite a few really important points. And one of the points that you raised was something I think we've touched on in a previous conversation that we've had, which was it's more the children of immigrants who may still be my age. I'm 31, and I have no lived experience of being under a dictatorial regime or an authoritarian regime, but my parents do. And then you have stories of other immigrants who are starting to see a flare-up of post-traumatic stress responses in their parents or in their grandparents, because what they're seeing right now seems to be very similar to what they have experienced in the past. Whereas people who don't have that, even within their parents or grandparents, have never experienced these sorts of rules. They're less likely to have an idea that this is what's actually going on. In fact, my father said that what he's seeing right now appears worse in certain elements than what he grew up in communist Romania in terms of the controlling behavior. Now, of course, he has his own story, and you have to question how much of that is his post-traumatic stress being re-triggered and seeing things wider than they are, or is this actually what's going on? Is it actually worse than what they lived through in certain controlling elements? So I think that's a really important point that you bring up. The other point is that always gets me scratching my head is what is the end game? What is a government that would like to control certain elements of their populace? What is their end game? Why are they trying to do this? And this is where people get into what are termed conspiracy theories, and it's like, oh, this is what I mean, the other day we had the New South Wales Chief Health Officer refer to the New World Order in her speech and say, this is how it's going to be in the New World Order.
I saw that. It was slowed down. The New World Order. But there's a lot of people who want to get even. If you feel like a loser, something in your life, the easiest thing to blame is some white heterosexual male. That's because everybody's had a boss who's like that. Isn't he the guy that tormented you? Didn't he look like that? Didn't he look like somebody like, I don't know, Trump or something? Everybody has one of those, and a lot of people don't realize they just have trouble with bosses, and it has nothing to do with the white heterosexual big male who owns country clubs. Then they find out when they get a little older that all bosses are like that, and they hate all bosses. So their problem is about bosses. But the higher probability is running into somebody like that who's a white heterosexual male conservative, I guess. And so it's a very handy thing, ready-made to go. And it's ready-made because aren't you angry? And everybody has some bone to pick. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. And what the demonizing factor is, don't you want to control those people so they don't harm you, so you can get ahead in the job? Remember who did that to you? And so if you're young and you've never seen how people get manipulated, especially this sort of psychopathic manipulation of people's emotions, then you don't know. It's like, no, I don't want people doing bad things. I don't want them spreading disease. I don't want them polluting the air. And they don't realize that the fix, which is making you do something and being obedient, becomes always the worst thing, always. And because we've had about 120 experiments in this time, certainly communism, every one of them absolutely disaster. But it gets young people. Young people go for it because they have no sense of human nature as it not no sense, of course they do, but they don't know that how it just keeps methodically dividing and getting larger and larger, and it draws in power hungry people. And it's not just it happens on the left and the right, but it's also some people are just like that, independent of politics, but then it drives their politics. So I can see it because because I talk to a lot of people like you do, and of every age and generation. I teach classes of young people, and we talk about these things, and you can see that they don't realize how they can be had, and that they're being worked and they're being manipulated. And the Nazis were able to do it. The Soviet, the communists were able to do it. Even you remember in Japan throughout the early 20th century, and that whole culture, they got everybody to be obedient, and that was what this is what the good thing is you become obedient. And how long it took, and the great thing about it is that the kind of the slow percolating revolution in Japan, where people said, I'm not going to listen to these. I'm going to not listen to these people anymore. I'm not going to play that game. It turned out they were women, young women, from the late teens to early to mid 20s. That's who told these guys to go blow it out their ass. They said, we're not going to do it.
Oh, wow.
We're not going to do it. And that's who led it. And that was mostly in the 1990s. It happened, and more in the 1920s. So the girls and then the women, young women in Japan, led that sort of cultural revolution. And in a sense, it was just like, we're not going to play this anymore. We're not going to play this game that you're trying to do.
This is interesting. Okay, I want to pick up on that one because recently now they've reversed it because there was a lot of public pressure, which makes you think a lot of this is about public pressure rather than the scientific evidence that they have to back up certain rules that they put out. But they banned families from taking their kids to the park.
Sure.
They stopped all of that.
Well,
Skate parks. But
it's very, I mean, this now it's leftist, and most leftists, most Marxists, they don't have families, so they come from broken families. So to them, the family is an evil thing. They've never had it really, or they come from very broken sort of backgrounds, and so sure they want to destroy it. And so to have like a so-called normal, regular family, they hate this, and that's what they want to destroy. And communists have always tried to do that. That's one thing like the Nazis did not do. They wanted to control women to have babies and have regular nuclear family. They're all in control, right? And they're all the same. And to me, fascists and communists are the same people. And I think this is borne out by the historical
history.
context.
Yeah.
Really
and
is.
I think what you mentioned with the young women in Japan that were rebelling against these sorts of top-down mandates, the controlling behavior. What we had, especially when those parks were closed down, was mothers. Mothers were the ones that were speaking up so much again. I mean, they'd been tolerant up until that point, but the most vocal majority around that mandate were mothers. And then there were people going around clipping the little plastic ties that they had. This park is closed. They tied swings together, and then people would clip those, and then other people would write on the back of those signs, this park is open by the taxpayers of this government, so they reverse the government mandates. The people reverse the government mandates, and after about a week or two or so, the government backed down on that one. But now skate parks are still closed, even though so many people are still going to the skate parks. You saw so many people breaking the rules now, because 19 months into this, probably going on to 20 months, people are starting to get really sick and tired of it. But
if you go to San Francisco, and Los Angeles, they want to be very obedient. They're very leftist, and it's true in New York and most of Massachusetts. But if you come to Southern California, like in Orange County, people will try to control behavior, and everybody laughs, and they get run out of town. And they'll say this is closed, and everybody will go to the beach, and everybody will hang out, and they'll go shopping, and they'll go to restaurants, and they just disobey it, right? This is civil disobedience. But so it's not just the state. All these states are mixed. It's the counties and cities within the states that attract certain types of rebellious people, and there's no money to be collected by being against fascism and communism. And so it doesn't collect money, it's just freedom. And so you have to have somebody who wants freedom. But usually those people are quite nice. If somebody who's really very much against control, they usually treat people at the golden rule, right? And I think common behavior is that. You get somebody who really wants everybody controlled, watch them carefully, because this is where your sociopathy will be.
Tell me a little bit more about that. How and the niceness as well as the watching carefully and the controlling behavior. Can you tease that apart a little bit?
Well, it's purely how much in you has to do with your need to control your mate, your husband, your wife, your friends, your business. That's an individual trait, and so when people. Okay, so there's that part of it. It's just individual. And then there is the part when you say about being nice, what I mean by nice is not controlling, and it's not, a lot of people who try to control you, the essence of psychopathic and sociopathic and narcissistic manipulation is to make you believe I'm doing this for you because I like and love you. It's the con, it's the big con. And so I don't mean nice that way, because anybody doing this who's into controlling somebody else, and the move now in Australia and certainly in the United States and other places is by the left. it's always because we're trying to save the world. We're trying to save you. We're trying to keep you from getting sick. We're going to keep you from getting sick, you see. And but they, without any consideration of what they've just done to you. And if you go through a lot of the interviews in Nazi Germany, but also in East Germany, in places like Peru, with the, Peru was awful because that was a Maoist uprising for years. That's a shining path. And that was all submission and control, but they did it because they loved you and they loved the society. So Peru has always had a very strong Maoist, leftist sort of control freak show going, and it was also half and half in Chile. And so there's no one answer, right? We talk about the individual, how you're wired. It's probably partially genetic, and if you have problems epigenetically, that is, you were abused early, you spend your life getting even and trying to control other people, which helps you control yourself in some weird way. And so there's that's why these early experiences are so important, because you permanently become fixating on getting even with the world in a certain group of people who you find to be your tormentors, and these are the controllers. And you can tell that I'm not very much into people who like to control others. I do not have any particular drive personally to control other people's behaviors, and this is that's why I'm a real libertarian. I just don't want you doing it in my front yard. Do anything you want, right? Just I don't want my grandchildren to have to look at it. These people want to force your grandchildren and children to watch them do these things.
Okay.
This is pure control.
And this is what brings us down to, I think, what in Australia there have been people calling a shadow pandemic. And what they talk about in the shadow pandemic, they've been talking about the mental health impacts, especially on younger children, because of these apparently draconian measures. And I found out what draconian measures were. That comes from a particular Roman emperor who had draconian law. I think his name was it started with Draco something or other. And he instituted all these mandates, all these laws, very totalitarian, and now we're starting to see a resurgence of it. So this isn't new stuff. This is age old. But I want to pick your brain, and I know that this isn't something we've studied or we have research at hand. So I want to be a little bit more informed but speculative at the same time. If we take a neuroscientific view of brain development, of children being denied socialization with other children, of children not seeing other children at all because they've had to stay in home for say 23 hours a day. At certain points, we weren't allowed to get out of our home unless we went out for 1 hour during the day. And this is really interesting. What are the impacts from a short, medium, and long range goal of the brain development when all these external socializing influences are taken away from us? Do you have something that you can lend to that from a neuroscientific point of view?
One of the big impetus to the idea that environment is so important in the development of young children, toddlers, babies, people in the crib, early development is so important. It came from the Romanian children through the 70s and 80s who had very little physical contact, and they really a messed up group. And so then it became like, well, it's very important. The conclusion of this was it's very important that we have lots and lots of human interaction for babies, toddlers, infants. But the thing is, they were so abused. They didn't have normal contact. They had zero contact, almost zero. They were swaddled, and then they were just fed. That's it. And that's different than having to go crazy the other way, which is the way it has gone in the past, after that 30 years, that there's, children need love and attention and hugging all the time. It's not true. They need a normal average amount. They don't need all this extra stuff. So that was one of the things. It was that the Romanian infant study that really was very misleading. And I was involved in a series of talks and in the film called DAU, where we studied this and talked about it. That's has been out for about a year or so, about Lev Landau, but it's about this sort of abuse. We actually had children who had been through sorts of neglect and everything, and I kind of spent time talking about brain development in somebody who's severely isolated. That's different than normal average. So we tended to go the other way. And you don't need a lot for the average person. Now, if you put these all on a spectrum of the amount of contact a kid needs, some need a lot, some don't need any at all, and it seems to be genetically determined. So there's no general answer to this because everybody is different. Although most people are in the middle, it's regressed toward the mean, and so most people are in the middle, need some about a hugging and love and contact. But it went from the Romanian babies to this ridiculousness afterwards, where you have to be with your child all the time, giving them support. Now, and so that kind of muddied it up. But that sort of over support doesn't seem to help much. Kids will snap back to, unless they're abused, okay, really abused early, they will snap back to who they genetically are. So you find people in these lockdowns that do perfectly well. The kids that absolutely well. And in fact, it's a relief. It's a complete relief because they don't have all these people all over them giving all this empathy and warmth and huggy love, which they really don't want or need, right? The parents need it, and the society needs it, but they don't. So it's a freeing thing for, as it's turned out, for many people. That includes children who are just absolutely happy schooling at home, absolutely happy not having to be forced to socialize. Now, if you take someone like me, I'm an extrovert and just fed off of constant interaction. And for me, I eat people and things and interactions up. And I gobble up people because I'm such an extrovert. Somebody like me feeds off of that and lives off of that. But the thing is, as I have found out in the past, couple of years, that this pandemic for me has been extremely freeing. I have no need to do the stuff I used to do. I've become the old, as you can tell, becoming the old grumpy man, which is you become intolerant of this push to be always with people and always with. But I was like the poster boy for the extrovert who needed constant contact and stimulation. Right now, I'm happy to be alone. But people come over, they'll come over. I don't have to go out. People come over, family. So I still get it. It's not like I'm starved, but people are so upset, my friends, because I'm so happy to be alone with my books that I don't even like really, but I have to read. And so there you've got somebody who his whole life was wired, the personality of somebody who thrived off interaction and probably really needed that. Now couldn't give a shit. That's me, right? And it's been, so for me, the whole pandemic's been wonderful because I don't have to be on all the time, and I have to be the social person. Now, there are other people, and you go case by case with this. I'm going to switch to something, generalize this a little bit to discuss it in the neuroscience way. Okay, you want to hear the neuroscience way? If you look at the genetics and the brain scans of people who are raised in an inner city versus a suburb or outside in the country, their responses to buildings, and you can see it in the brain scans too, and all the closeness with everybody, all the social closeness and the buildings maybe on top are very, very, very different. And people will, not surprisingly, choose the outback versus downtown in the middle of the city. And that seems to be wired both genetically but you can see it in PET scans, fMRIs, that their response to these different environmental situations, quite different. And so again, what I'm, the point is that there's so much individual differences. It's hard to have this conversation about the generalities of it because it's scattered all about. And so I think you find a lot of people who've enjoyed it. Of course, when you're younger, you want to be partying, you want to be, my kids are with your kids, and we're going to do all this stuff. You have that, but it's a transitory stage. Which many people who are older can't wait to stop that, even though they want to have, my kids are playing with your kids, we're going to the mall, we're going to all these places. But I don't think it's more than, 10, 15% of people who really like all that interaction, but we're forced to do it.
So let's apply that, because I do see that there are individual case by case differences when it comes to some people, including myself, who may feel okay, staying at home on the weekends and doing some research or doing some reading or doing some recording or whatever it might be, something that I find useful, and having these stay-at-home orders are very helpful. On the other hand, I guess the question on top of that would be, if children are taken away from school, and then their predominant mode of learning is in front of a computer with no kind of children sitting next to them, learning from them, learning what's socially and inappropriate or socially appropriate, having discussions with other children in the context of the classroom, not having to kind of balance one screen with another screen, and then having parents who have to work as well as provide schooling for their children at the same time. In these situations where it's happened a significant period of time, do you know, or can you make any kind of speculations around, if that's taken away, what are general impacts in terms of socialization and within the brain for a school-aged child who's,
Well, I would, of the educators I've talked to and the psychologists I've talked to here, and teachers, because I know so many at different levels, grade school teachers, they, if you come from a upper class, or an educated, you could be poor but educated, and have that, the training and the background to be able to self-learn and to be home taught, it's been wonderful. It's wonderful, and let's face it, for most people who are in school, they're learning how to deal with jerks and assholes and bullies. Who needs it, right? It's like, well, get in there and fight, or get in there and mix it up. It's like, who needs that? I mean, so most of this thing about socializing with other kids is dealing with assholes and obnoxious people. But if you are in a family that has the educational values, you don't have to be brilliant or have money really at all. This is just an appreciation for learning, and you've got somebody there, a couple of people who, that includes siblings with parents and aunts and uncles, and some of the extended family who have that ethos. This is going to definitely help them, and it's definitely going to hurt people like inner city minority kids who don't have that. That's where this lockdown stuff is really hurting. Will be hurting and damaging kids, because most people, middle class and who have this ethos will go right through it, and probably these kids will be learning better than they would be having been thrown into the school, because they'll be able to use not only the interpersonal things with extended family and some selected neighbors, learning groups, but also learning to do it by distance and virtually, which is going to be here anyway. You have to. That's the way business is done, and learn to do things Zoomy wise. And so learning that this is a great boon for the middle and upper class educated, what which we call class class X, which are educated people. And so these lockdowns by the left, if they're done by anybody, but now it's by the left, are really damaging poor inner city kids who don't have the home ethos and resources. So that's who they're destroying, not the other people. The other people are gaining by
Okay.
this.
I think you touched on a good point. There's one commentator here in Melbourne who calls us the laptop class. Where we can do all our work on the laptop. We can be able to just not be disadvantaged. We still get the same wage. Businesses have to pay less overheads. It makes sense to be working from home more than working at the office, for example. And then in terms of the research that I've perused, in terms of the ones who are most affected by these types of lockdowns tend to be exactly what you've said, those who are disadvantaged to begin with. So those who are disadvantaged are the ones who are at real risk here. And although there are some children who would prefer the virtual learning and may actually have better one-to-one help because they may have a parent who's able to be there instead of a teacher with 30 plus children in the class. They have more guidance around that area. So I guess that's where my question kept going back to the socialization side of things, because educationally it may be beneficial for some, but then also for those who are doing it tough, less advantageous. But then from a social point of view and a mental health point of view, is what's the data support there? And I tend to take a look at, there's a recent paper published, I think a couple of months ago in June or July, and I'd have to get the name of it, but I will link it down in the description to this podcast video, that those children and babies who are born during the pandemic are significantly behind in terms of developmental achievements, from language to even emotional regulation and clinginess to caregivers, and also fear to other children who are not they don't see often because of these stay-at-home orders that we keep going back to. And that paper was authored by I think something like a dozen different researchers. And I'd have to consider those elements and balance them with those who are doing really well and those whose academic those who essentially have the money to benefit out of this, I would say.
Well, I don't know. It's not just money, though. If you look at traditionally, I think probably in Australia, but certainly in the United States, all those kids, the kids were, homeschooled rurally, who didn't have, all the large classes or even classes at all, turned out quite well. Have turned out quite well, and they kind of the salt of the earth type of people, and have been very successful. Think of all the people who used to working in garages. This is the DIY people. They did fantastically, and so of course, if you stay at home and there's no parent, it's single parent, say the mother, for example, and she's working all the time, and you have a caregiver, this is a different setup. This is not a proper home life for somebody, and not that it was chosen, but that's not a fair comparison. You'd have to look at each one of these kids in the study to see what that family was about. You can play all sorts of mayhem with statistics, and if you want a certain outcome, you will manipulate how you group these, the data, to come up with a point that you want to make. So if you want to protect certain things, if you're part of a teachers union and you're part of that study, you want to do things to protect the teachers union. And that's what you'll fudge the data that way. You see this all the time. review papers, and you can see the politics just oozing out of it. But if you just look at it agnostically in terms of the politics, and look at the outcomes of kids, rural kids or suburban kids that are raised, it's got to be in a family that has the values. They have to be wealthy, all right, but they have to have an appreciation for education. If you look at, I mean, if I look at my family, my grandfather was never educated, zero education, and he just made a commitment when he came from Sicily and landed that all of his daughters would be educated, and they all became highly educated. They went to college. It's back in the 1920s and 30s. They all went to graduate school. They all had advanced degrees, and this is came from the font of a guy who was absolutely unschooled, but he had and absolutely impoverished. He lived on the street, but he had it in his head the value of education. So there's somebody completely uneducated, no money, no background, but he just made that commitment. So in that case, everybody in our family turned out fabulously educated, and it had nothing to do certainly with money, but it had to do with an attitude.
Okay, yeah, I pick up on that one, and a lot of that. There's been a whole bunch of research. Carol Dweck talked a lot about the fixed and growth mindsets that you can appear in everyday life, whether it's at schooling and having the ability to say, even if I may make mistakes, I'm going to keep trying until I get better and better at X, Y, and Z, versus this is just what you're born with, and you have certain abilities and inabilities that you cannot generally build on to a significant extent.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that is the mindset differences. I do like that way of exploration. As a question then would be, because this edges into the political sphere as well. We have what here in Victoria is called a mental health crisis, where there are allegations that more and more young adults are starting to take their lives because of certain lockdown measures. And this needs to be verified more. And I think the verification is a bit tricky because it's observational and anecdotal, more in terms of, well, this person in my school, a couple of his friends committed suicide the other week, and then you speak to another person, they're like, well, six people from this school committed suicide. 14, 15-year-olds committed suicide, and then you have the actual data that is shown in the media and in the Bureau of Statistics, which show that there isn't much of an increase year on year in suicides. And then you have these stories about younger people committing suicide, and especially younger girls starting to take their own lives here in Victoria. And some parents are putting that down to the extra amount of stress that's happening because of these lockdown measures, and the I want to say controlling element, but it's more unpredictability, and not knowing what's going to happen next is really a tricky one, because that there doesn't seem to be any set knowledge on this is when this is going to end. It's like we're in the middle of a this is what you can and can't do, and it's going to change when we say it changes. So that piggybacks off the political ideation that we've talked about before. And if we were to project this into the future, what needs to change in our society for these sorts of things not to be the first recourse of the government to say, let's lock everyone down and tell you what you can and can't do? Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share around that area?
Now we know in the past few years, markers for suicide, completed suicide, not just attempted suicide, but completed suicide, is a heavy genetic component, and there's a lot of signs going in. And so it's one thing to associate, people will want to associate as a matter of causation, but to show causation is a big jump. If it becomes a romantic notion to commit suicide, you're going to see more suicides than people who are naturally have a tendency to begin with. Then it becomes a heroic act. It becomes a heroic artistic act. And you'd see this in some wartime societies where people know they're going to die and they will go gladly into more. It's a kind of suicide, right? And see, if this is a way to make you a hero in your own mind and to leave a hero and to do some great artistic heroic act, then that'll tend to be a tiebreaker. But it doesn't mean that the cause of it had anything to do with anything other than a genetic and epigenetic predisposition to it. But now if you have what's permissive, it's a permissive effect that it's now, if it's cool to be suicidal, it's cool to do this, self-harm, then there's going to be a higher probability, but that doesn't mean it was caused by that thing. It just means that there's a permissive effect.
Okay, I pick up that point. I think it's a very valuable point to make. You mentioned epigenetics. Is it possible that what's happening right now could influence certain genetic markers that weren't influenced before, to make people who are otherwise not necessarily suicidal to become more suicidal? Is that a right parallel to make?
Yeah, the way that study has not been done. That study has not been done for suicide, but the idea is, and the findings have been that there are genes that are involved in different kinds of depression. There's many kinds of depression, as you know, and one of the great stressors is the release of cortisol during times of stress. So you have maternal stress. So if you have a mother who's pregnant, who's in a lockdown, she can't work under great stress, she is releasing cortisol, which is then making it into the baby's brain, also the frontal lobe, which affects social behavior, but also the limbic system, which will affect those systems involved in not only depression, but suicide. And so there you have the mother being affected, and then now the cortisol will epigenetically mark or fix the promoters and inhibitors of genes that then regulate depression and other behaviors. So you could see that this is, the mothers who are under stress, again, it's going to tend to affect more people who are impoverished, poor, or maybe even minority people that don't have those supports. And so there you could see the effect of permanently, putting an epigenetic methyl mark or an acetyl mark onto the promoter inhibitor of genes, which then makes that kid like that forever. Therefore, the probability every time the kid has depression, especially as they're getting older and more systems are kicking in, monoamine systems, serotonin, et cetera, then they're going to be more likely to commit suicide. Yeah. And so that again is, we've been talking mostly the impact on women, both in terms of fighting back, but also the ones that are impacted, poor women, poor young mothers, certainly is where the nexus and the nidus of this whole barrage is. Most other people can blow it off, you know what I mean? They really can, but young women are under a lot of stress this way, and that's where I think the problem lies with the lockdowns. It's not allowing, young women, especially if they're pregnant, or young mothers who can't get out, who don't have the social group that they would. It's important for young mothers to get together. As far as I can tell, it's important for old mothers to get together too. And it gets even, more so. It's 60, 70, 80-year-olds. And, part of the, the blue zone, the guy who studied the blue zones is, and I asked him, because we gave a couple of talks together, and he, there was a place in Taiwan, there was a place in Greece, a place in Sardinia, there was a place in Sicily, and there was one here in, California, Southern California. And I said, well, what is it the nutrition, the exercise? He goes, no. He says, these are people that had bonds, mostly women, can be men too, that formed very early bonds as sisters, but also aunts, but mothers, young mothers, and they stayed close their whole life, and they share all this. And these are the people who live to be 115 years old and live wonderfully. And so for men, it's less important, but for young women, to bond that way because they got this added family burden and child burden. And then it becomes, I think, much more profound, not only through the transgenerational route and through, embryonically, but also their behavior and their stress all the way through. So whoever's doing it in Australia, they should be embarrassed. They should be ashamed of themselves because what they're harming are young women, especially poorer women.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense because then you've got, if we piggyback off this research, we see that those mothers, those who are pregnant right now, and those who have young children, those are the ones that aren't able. I mean, they're not able to speak with family members unless they're breaking the rules, unless they're illegally meeting up with their family, or they're illegally going to the park, or they're illegally seeing a grandparent of some sort. This is a really interesting one because they're the ones that are more and more affected, and yet men generally don't have the same considerations. But yet I'm not sure if Australia parallels the US in terms of statistics on suicide, where men are, I think, something like 6 times more likely to take their own lives than women are. Do you have any insights into that?
Well, there, in working with the Department of Defense, where you have people, a lot of suicides in veterans, okay, and a lot of the high numbers are there. They're also with, gang members. They're in, there are certain gang members, the guys who run it are very resistant. They never get killed. They never commit suicide. They don't die. These guys are immortal. But the other people, there's much more. The younger ones who don't have that resilience are the ones that are more likely to. So you got a lot of inner city kids, guys that would be 18, 21. And you see a lot of the, inner city Black deaths with the men, young men. It's called, probably the same in Australia. It's death by cop, which is doing something. Basically, you're good. You're going to die, right? It's a kind of a suicide. It's a kind of suicide, and therefore you see higher numbers there. Now, politically, this turns into something else. The whole narrative is like, well, they're wrong, but this is you see it in combat, post-combat PTSD situations, but also in this, death by cop, especially inner city Blacks in the United States who are part of gangs. That's where you see the higher rates. So if you don't have those in Australia, it would be a different cohort.
I think I was speaking to a nurse more recently, and what this nurse said was their wards are generally, large with mental health. More so with the lockdowns, they start to get more increase, and especially in males. There was a recent case where one guy was chasing a police officer with a knife, and he was trying to suicide by in that sense. So he wanted to kill himself, but he ended up getting capsicum sprayed and then taken to hospital and kind of go from there. But you can see how
suicide foiled. But it's easy to put that statistic into police brutality, into poverty and everything, where it's really somebody who's struggling and who has been altered because of early traumas and bullying, etc., who has given up and is now it's suicide by cop. And
No, I guess I was just picking up on your theme with police brutality, because there's a lot in the media, especially in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement, in terms of police brutality in the US. I hear, not so much here in Australia, but the only reports we're starting to get right now with police brutality have happened, in my view, over since lockdown started to come on board. Before that, we never had a conversation around police being brutal, except in slow minority experiences with Indigenous populations. And what we see here is more and more police officers are being held into account by the people, not necessarily by the legal or the governmental systems, because they are enforcing government mandates almost indiscriminately, and perceptibly, which is what they need to do. I mean, it's almost like there's a tricky question there. Police officers need to enforce the law. The current law is whatever the chief health officer says, which is don't go 2.5 kilometers either side of your house. And if you're outside of that, the police can fine you exorbitant amounts of money if you're not wearing a mask, or if you're going into the city to protest. People were being shot at with rubber bullets I think it was just under a month ago, because they were there. It's really interesting at the front line of the protest in Melbourne that happened just a few weeks ago. There were the protesters were saying, "Please help us. We don't want to be here. We don't want you to be here," that sort of stuff. And then there were the police officers, the right police on the other side, and one of the police officers was like, "Come on, pussies, let's get them," And then they started, there were a couple police officers shooting at the protesters with rubber bullets and then capsicum spray and all that sort of stuff. So it's a really, really hard divide here. And then you've got anecdotal accounts of more and more police officers quitting their role, and the question is who's left behind when it comes to enforcing these laws. I guess many of my listeners will want to know, how do we address this? How do we look at this, and how do we move forward from here? I'm not sure if you have any thoughts to consider.
Well, first of all, I think
this.
everybody, hopefully by now, by self-proclamation, would understand that the BLM and Antifa is an international movement, and it's, this started 100 years ago, and it pops up at opportune times whenever there's a crisis. So the crisis part, the environmental crisis or the COVID, this is an opportune time to lock people down, put them under stress. So there's nothing new about this. This has been going on over 100 years, off and on. And the BLM and Antifa are communists, and this is what they feed off of. So where else do you have to go? What else does one have to know? And that this is people that are grabbing for power, okay? And there's no mystery there.
The recent protests, which is really interesting because we saw differences in response with the Black Lives Matter protests in comparison to the anti-lockdown protests. So the Black Lives Matter protests were not, you actually had, there's a really famous picture now, infamous almost, of 3 Victoria police officers taking a knee at the Black Lives Matter protest. And then that's juxtaposed to anti-lockdown protests where they're spraying people who are saying we want our freedoms back, and you've got little children who are in the crowd being pepper sprayed as well. And so there's a distinction here between Black Lives Matter and the anti-lockdown protests. It seems that the boot comes heavier on those who are protesting against government mandates in comparison to those who are putting forward the Black Lives Matter, what do you call it?
It's a communist agenda.
Yeah, agenda, that's the way.
I mean, I met with the guy who was the top guy, not the women. I met at a Google conference and spent 3 meetings with the head of BLM over this year, to the point that they want to be on the board. I think I mentioned this to you before.
Yeah, you did.
I told him, I said, you go back there and tell them you're going to get an old white guy on your board of BLM. They're going to laugh at you. And he said, yeah, they laughed at me. But it's basically, and they know it's a Marxist thing. I mean, this is that may not scare people, because a lot of people, maybe your age and younger, that's like, well, that sounds fun. It's Marx, that's fun. What's wrong with that? Capitalism is evil, because they have no idea that this has deep roots, and it's the same thing, the same grab for power and the, imposing chaos. This is not a conspiracy theory. They'll tell you how this works. This is Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School 101. I mean, they went through this and spelled it out. That's who taught these people. I say these people, like the Antifa, the modern Antifa, and the modern intellectuals. This is all, this is what they say. This is what they're teaching. So I don't know why people would even say that it would be something like conspiracy theory, because they're the ones that openly are saying this, and because it's true. And so I don't know what kind of apologia one needs and what kind of explanation will compare this to this, and that's made up. It's who's writing the copy, who's holding the camera.
I guess the question is that there seems to be a practical difference between the types of people who protest against the government versus government mandates. And mind you, it's not government per se, because we have people from all political spheres coming together and saying these lockdowns are causing more harm than good, versus the Black Lives Matter. I forgot what you called it again. The kind of paradigm that the Black Lives Matter proponents would espouse. In Australia, it's not so much the Black Lives Matter that has a big following, but now whenever there are protests, there are more. We want to get our freedoms back. Because the question is, like, there's a philosophical question: are you free if you can lose your freedom, or if someone has to give your freedom back? And it's kind of like held as a carrot. If you do this for us, we're going to give you your freedom back. The philosophical question is, were you ever really free in the first place?
Yeah, you were about 10 years ago. And so were we. Yeah, we were. It was 10 years ago. Or give or take. Yes. And even more so before that. But this sort of push to tyranny is, and if you worked with communists, I've worked with them of different ilks, both Maoists and Marxist Leninists and Trotskyites, and spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe and Russia, Ukraine, with different proponents of this, including some of the prime ministers and the presidents of those countries after they split from the Soviet Union. And these are very well-worn techniques. These are things from 1920, and so there's nothing new. I now sound like the old guy. Yeah, I've been there before, but I spent a lot of time conversations and going to meetings on panels, lots of time, and a lot of Zoom calls with people who know a lot about this and who were part of the mix, certainly, and who've now sort of seen the light, or who are still belligerent about it. And if you work in the university systems, University of California system, this is where the Marxists are. This is the people who were taught by Bakunin, but mostly by Herbert Marcuse and the German Frankfurt School and this is where woke communism comes from. So this is, again, this is no conspiracy theory. This is, talk to them, they'll tell you. Yeah, this is the plan, because this is the just thing to do. So, but in order to give you, say, you need to you need freedom, but we first have to take the freedom from you, and then we're going to give it back to you, which is what you just said. This is an old game. This is like, having a lot of studies in psychopathy and sociopathy. This is part of the game. This is, in terms of people with NPD, I own you, but I'm now going to give you your freedom, dear. These are the very toxic relationships that people have. So it happens on a micro scale, an interpersonal scale, but it certainly happens in different groups and with these movements. So I don't wring my hands trying to figure out what it is, because we've seen it for over 100 years.
So I guess that's the difference there. I guess the question is, what are the options for people who are living through this? And I've got my own ideas, but the question is, practically speaking, if you're in a system like this, and I go back from a psychological point of view, you look at Milgram's experiments, you look at the Stanford prison experiment from Zimbardo, you consider that around 65% of participants at the beginning would cause harm just because they were told to cause harm, and about 80%, 100% will go to one point to cause harm. About 65% will go to the next level of harm, and about 60 or so percent will go to almost kill somebody just because a position in authority would tell them to. And this has been replicated, Milgram's experiment.
But it hasn't been. You know, Phil Zimbardo, who I know, we follow each other around to talk. So he knows the nature of evil. And
can you get me an interview with him? Can you get me an interview with him?
Well, he's so beleaguered the past couple of years because people saying it doesn't work. What he was saying that works, and the Stanford experiment and the Milgram experiment, they don't work. They were, you know, people can't replicate them, and you can't. They're not replicable in a statistically meaningful way, in a controlled way. So Phil is quite beleaguered, a sweet guy. He's a wonderful guy, but he's gotten beaten up in the past 10 years because people just don't believe it. I don't think you can. Let's put it this way. I don't think you could take those data to the bank at all. But it may be true for, you know, for some groups. Part of the problem is that those are pre-selected people, both self-selected and pre-selected people, not a cross-section of population. And you get
I have to No, I was just saying I have to review that data because I remember last time I reviewed the data, there were other representational research studies cross-culturally that found similar percentages in different countries in terms of how people would react just because they were told to. And if you read books like Ordinary Men on a police battalion in Poland, where you have just an ordinary company of about 500 Polish soldiers who were ordered to effectively kill any Jews that they were told to kill at the beginning. They showed the slow descent into that those actions
that is certainly a self-selected, pre-selected group, not the average person. You see, if you get, you know, hardcore World War II veterans fighting both Nazis and Russians, there's a tough sons of bitches that are going to kill. You know, they will follow orders and kill. But this is not the average person. You can't take that and say this is how people are. That's how that kind of person is, yeah. But that is not the average person at all. And so that's the problem. One of the problems. The other problems, if you take apart the instructions that people were given doing this test, they're extremely flawed. And it's a lot around the instructions, okay, which absolutely predisposes you to induce harm because you don't really believe it, you know? And so a lot of the critique is around that. And, you know, you should call, if you email Phil, I think he's getting tired of getting kind of attacked on this, you know, because he really is a sweet, wonderful, bright guy. But I don't know if he wants to talk about it a lot anymore. He was up to about 5 years ago.
Well, I guess I'll say, well, what does he have to say? Well, what is his impression of the outcomes of his research around this sort of stuff? What's his impression?
Well,
what is he getting attacked on?
But the experimental psychologists and cog sci people who are in criminology, but just in terms of experimental design, have found the experimental design to be quite flawed. And he doesn't. He knows that. But he would still say, "Well, you should ask him. You know, don't have," because I'm fond of him, but it's taken a beating because of the self-selection. You know, the cross section of people involved. You know, it's like getting a bunch of psychology students in college who volunteer for the psychopathy study. You've got some self-selection going on there. I'm like this, man, I'm badass. And so if you get rid of that, the effect goes away. That's a problem.
Well, the Milgram's experiments, from memory, they had a milkman, a police officer, students of psychology.
That's a bit different. They had more of a mix.
Yeah. But it was a small sample size, something like 20 or so. I think
It
20 to 40 people or so.
was very
Um,
and not
there's,
controlled very well. So it's
mhm.
I don't know why people that's those studies aren't redone, well.
I'd have to, yeah, they're good to look at in this context, because these contexts we have these mandates to say, because we think this is the right thing to do, this is what you must do. And then at the beginning you have a high conformity, and then as it goes on, people are less and less likely to conform. Like, consider 1 year ago, there were no cars on the road during these lockdowns, very very minimal cars on the road during these lockdowns. A year later, the cars are up and down, going around as if things are okay, or perceptively okay, which many people think they are. They many believe that this has been overblown, and the mandates are disproportionate to the risk that these individuals may be seeing. So, an interesting set of propositions, and I have to figure out a way to begin to close this, because I think we can go into so many different realms, and we only have a small amount of time left. Uh, but, but if there's anything you'd like to say, anything you'd like to kind of bring up in consideration of what we've spoken about so far that we haven't talked about yet.
No, I think I tried to insert and interrupt you enough times with my own what I know about the data and the lack of data, but also just my personal experience and interest, and how the mechanisms of how this goes on. Now, from talking with me that the fix in what is in Australia seems bizarre. You got Nurse Ratched there talking about the New World Order. I mean, is she out of her mind? I mean, it's like, what is her problem? And she can't wait to control people. Did she have like a bad marriage or something? It seemed a little too bizarre to me. And her whole it's like out of a bad movie. We're gonna control you, and this is it. It's the New World Order. You gotta be kidding me. But you gotta look. You ask, what is her background? I would always ask, what is her background? Who's she mad at? Who's she getting even with? What is her politics? You got to ask all these things. And I don't know her. I just can't stop laughing from that show she put on. It looked made up. It was so bad.
Yeah, and I think that's the tricky thing, because we have everything is effectively pinned on chief health officer directions. So in these states of emergency, there's legislation that says, if we're in a state of emergency, anything that the chief health officer says can be mandated, and it becomes very, as I'm told, it becomes very legally difficult to argue against those particular mandates. But the
Well, yeah,
problem
I
is they're
mean,
not.
Mengele had some of these specific legal orders. Joseph Mengele he
Mm,
had those where what he was saying and what the medical people were saying were became very important, and turned went from medical into a legal issue. And
mm,
so that's an old Nazi thing for sure. And when it happened, also in China, several times over the past 100 years. And so, yeah, whenever you get people who they're not doctors, they're not administrators, they're administrators of administrators, they're politicians, and they
mm,
say things, you know, ex cathedra. All of a sudden, it becomes it's a combination of a medical and a moral. It's a moral imperative. And when you
mm,
hear this, this is obviously awful and dangerous, because these are people who are in their heart and soul and in their motivation want nothing more than to be in control. I mean, if you look at somebody like Fauci, who, I have friends who went to school with him and everything. He's a little guy, and he's so mad that he didn't get any credit for the whole HIV thing, and he's getting even with everybody. And I think the people who went to school with him know this. He's got the little man Napoleon complex, and he's going to control things, for God's sakes. But he hasn't seen a patient I don't know how long. He's not even an administrator. He's administrator of administrators, and these people have become the most dangerous, especially if they
mm,
have a bone to pick. Fauci has a long-standing bone to pick, He's got two actually. And with your medical officer, I don't know what's she got a bug in her body, who she's mad at, what she's getting even with. But it didn't sound right to me. It just didn't. And we got enough crazy people and power hungry people in the United States to go around. But your lady there seems to be diabolical.
I would say that
I
this
couldn't
is,
believe it when I saw it. It seems so ridiculous.
for clarity, this is the chief health officer of New South Wales, which they're also in a lockdown. In Victoria, we have our own chief health officer, which has, you know, he's got a lot of, yeah, there's been a lot of slack around his and it almost appears that the tricky thing is conformity, as far as I'm aware, comes when you trust the person of authority. But when the trust is broken between the person of authority, it's either trust or fear. And so when it comes to you losing that trust, then a person is less likely to conform. And the tricky thing here, we have conformity because of fear more than any trust. Because how can you gain trust when our politicians are saying, we've got the medical advice and we've got the medical details here, but we're not going to show them to you because it's not within your best interest.
Oh yeah.
This is
Sure.
exactly but this is what they've said. There's been multiple requests to provide the medical evidence, the advice, and time again, the Attorney General's response has been, it is not within the public's interest to see that medical advice.
Well, because it's a political move. It's obviously a political power play. I mean, it's pretty clear, I think.
Again, it's been such a riveting conversation with you.
See, I don't have to be nice. You have to be nice. You live there. But these sound like a couple of stinkers. Really, we got more stinkers to go around. But you got these little, the Nurse Ratchet and the other guy, and we're not going to tell you because you don't have you don't have the information to use it correct. We're not going to show you the real data, huh? Blah, 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 blah.
Where is the data? It's a tricky one, because and I stand more for, I like to get at truth more than feeling, and I think the conversations that I have, I really want to pursue it, and I don't care where it takes me. It's more a sense of, okay, I don't want to have a preconceived idea of how things are and then not try to question the opposite and say, all right, let's work this out. Let's try to figure this out together. And if that takes us into controversial lands, bring it on. I also think that we've got enough in media that tries to push a particular narrative, and alternative narratives are coming more and more, at least in Victoria and Australia, and they're trying to be subdued. And there's cancelling, social media cancelling going on, where it's a tricky situation that we're living through. I'll tell you what, Jim, again, it's been a really, really good conversation with you. And I want to, as we close, I want to ask you, is there anything you're really passionate about now? Like, what are you looking into right now? What are you working on right now that's getting you really excited that you might want to share with our listeners?
Well, I would say I try to not be passionate, because passion is if I get passionate about something, I tend to really doubt what I'm doing, because I shouldn't need passion. It's how interesting something is. And so I tend not to have passion, but I have motivation, certainly. And what I get interested in is just intellectually interesting. I've worked on all sorts of diseases, but it's not because anybody in my family has those diseases or me. They're just interesting scientific issues. So you find a lot of people who get in, it's like, why have you spent your life studying autism? You find out because their two children they have autism. It's very personal and very passionate. For me, I try to avoid things that I could be affected by. And if I am affected, because I have a certain politics, and and I am an agnostic, I'm not religious, and I am a libertarian in a libertarian party sense, because I don't like controlling other people. And so I do have those biases, but I try to not do my science in so much there. I kind of get bounced around. It's like whatever's interesting. And the things that are interesting right now, I was asked to be the chief scientific officer, I mentioned, of a gene editing company that will affect, it's really can be looked at as very Machiavelli. It's a powerful thing. We're getting positive results. It's like, oh, Jesus, so this, in terms of the science, it's, that's one thing, because you can't unring the bell of the technologies and the concepts. How it then becomes, public policy. Do you really want to have gene editing? And so I do like the ethical and moral issues, but I'm driven by the science. The other thing, that working on several ways are these gene regulators, these retrotransposons, both in schizophrenia and Alzheimer's, other disorders, but we're looking at it in ancient humans and ancient hominids, and and Neanderthals and Heidelbergensis. We're now looking at Soprano man, that's 480,000 years. So we're trying to put together the evolution of the human brain together, the differentiation of the brain, the tools, but also the genetics. Because we're interested, when did these big jumps take place, and what's responsible for these huge jumps? Why did we get language all of a sudden? In terms of evolutionary time, it happened immediately. It's like immediately bird feathers show up, immediately the placenta shows up, and these are not by regular Mendelian or Darwinian genetics at all. And so we study those funky transposons that are gathered up from viruses that are then used and seem to be used to make these huge jumps in human evolution. I mean, this is a kick. Anybody, and I get to play and do the thing with the skulls, and so it's very interesting. But I wouldn't say it's passionate. It's just so damn interesting. That's it. So that's what I get involved in. Once I try to be passionate about my children and my grandchildren and and my wife sometimes. And I try to put passion where I think passion will not, will be positive, will be a positive, as opposed to like I'm gonna prove that this is because some personal thing. So bad speaks that way. So, but I told you what I am passionate about, I guess, to say those two.
And I think the most important question of today's interview: why is there a clown staring at me behind you?
Well, there's several clowns.
There's a wonderful picture of a clown that looks like Pennywise.
Do you see that one up there?
Oh wow! You got an affinity.
Clowns that I have painted, evil clowns, for my grandchildren. I got a couple back. And
did you paint the one behind you?
I painted all these, yeah. And
there's one right behind you that's right next to the number 7.
Yes, that's one of the evil clowns. I don't have a frame, so I got it stuffed in there. But I did all these, kind of evil clown things, as just to get my grandkids to laugh at it. You know what I mean? It's like,
oh, that's so cool. Laughing fear and I love it. I love it. I tell my kids, you got to punch fear in the face, and that's a really good.
Fear in the face, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's one. The best one is up at the 3 grandkids. One granddaughter is getting married in 2 weeks, so I'll be a great grandfather pretty soon. I will be great.
Wow! Congratulations.
But she loves it, and she gets a kick out of it, and the other 2 do too. And they just think it's funny. It's a really scary. Some people get really freaked by it. I'm not a very good artist, but I nailed a couple of them. But the thing is, the things I kept is what nobody wanted. So the ones that are better, I actually gave away.
I love that one behind you. That one looks really freaky. And I love,
Which one of your sons? One of you, the younger son with the hair part opposite of yours? Or
His name is Micah. Yeah, he's my children. So I think my oldest son is more afraid of clowns and like weird dolls and that sort of stuff. But he really he likes to face those sorts of fears, and so he was like, I want to watch it, and I want to watch this, and I want to do that, and it's kind of like so interesting.
Some interdimensional being, you know, and these are fun. I talked to David Lynch, you know, he's a director, and
I've heard of the name. Yes,
you know,
Twin Peaks. Yes, yes.
he also did Eraserhead and all these other freak shows. So I spent a few hours with him, asking him where all these freakish images came from. And he goes, I don't know. I'm just a regular person.
Again, it's been such a wonderful time to speak with you, and I look forward to meeting up. Hopefully, meeting up with you one day. Once everything is all gone, and I'm traveling the States, going to California. We'll meet up for a coffee, and if you're
in Southern California, especially Orange County.
Yeah.
It's pretty wide open.
And if you're ever in Australia, hit me up. I'd love to. Well, I don't know if anyone would want to come to Australia these days, but hey, if you do in however long,
I want to personally meet and talk to Nurse Ratched. I really want to meet her, and I want to do the whole thing with the New World Order. What a kick! I mean, it's like a gift. You know? No, great talking to you.
Thank you, Jim. I'll speak with you. I'll speak with you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.